Okay, it's 11:30 here in Japan, and welcome to the next special event that we have, and it's a cultural event, and it's one that I'm particularly excited about. If you love food, then I think you're going to love this. I'm very happy to be able to introduce today the session entitled Asia at the Crossroads: Conversations on Food, Politics and Culture. So that's an interesting thing to get us started off with. And what I did is I've asked my friend, collaborator, Haruko Satoh of the Osaka School of International Public Policy, where she's co-director of the Hakwer Centre and an IR specialist, to see if she wouldn't mind starting or having a conversation with her good friend Daisuke Utagawa, who's based in Washington and who is a Japanese trained chef, a sushi chef, restaurateur, and entrepreneur. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Haruko Satoh, and I'm going to stay here in the background. And it's 11:30 here in Japan. So by the time we finish this at 12:30, I think I will be very, very well ready for something to eat. So over to you. Haruko, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you
Very,
hear me?
I can.
Okay,
Over to you.
very, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, everybody. And thank you very much for joining this exciting session. I'm actually also very, very excited to be talking about food from a very sort of global, international perspective. And I'm very, very honored and glad to have Daisuke, who is, as Joe says, a very good friend. We actually go way, way back, probably in the early 70s, because of our parents' job. They were both together in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And Daisuke and I probably met in one of those weekend Japanese supplementary schools. But anyway, but in an adult life, we met about 30 years ago. And here we are, totally in different professions, but always having exciting discussions about, particularly about how Japanese food has evolved, not just domestically, but how it's been stylized, presented, understood, appropriated, exported by not just by the Japanese, but by people who love Japanese food or who want to make money out of sushi bars or whatever in the mutation of ramen. And I know that Daisuke has first gone from doing the managing Sushiko in Washington, D.C., to opening up the ultimate ramen experience, Daikaya, in Washington, D.C., which I understand is quite the go-to place. And I'm very glad. And I actually find it very interesting that he would go for these ultimate two types of what originates as more or less street food. Sushi is now, of course, understood to be a very sort of gourmand, high-end food, but its histories and origins go back to a much more humble, sort of, labor-intensive Edo quick street food. Ramen likewise has this very interesting history. I do not claim to know, but it's also become something that symbolizes with sushi, tempura, and ramen, the latest addition to the global sort of attraction for things coming out of Japan. And of course, we might actually call all of this as Japanese soft power in my area of studies. But today, actually, I don't want to use the word soft power for the reasons I will actually go and explain. One is that soft power means it's basically about states, countries trying to promote their own appeal. So there is that sort of very manipulative, but also strategic use of national cultures in putting money into promoting it in the way that certain people, in an arbitrary way sometimes, that they want to produce, to utilize soft power. But I think Japanese food, or food in general, I think isn't really a category of that sort of soft power. Namely because I think, and this is something that Daisuke points out, people love food. People love talking about food. And people get very passionate about their food. It is part of the physiology, it's part of the social and cultural background of every single person living on this earth. And whether they have these sort of national cuisines that you celebrate, these national labels are rather relatively more modern, and it actually comes with the introduction of state borders. But food has traveled and mutated and has connected people, as well as connecting people to the environment in which they live. So I think this is today I actually wanted to sort of have to get Daisuke's perspective from his very long and actually interesting and always innovative ways of thinking about food and what it does, in what context. It's a very powerful tool to bond people, but at the same time, it is something that also could be somewhat of a difficult sort of political tension arising from who has the ownership, for example, on Hainanese chicken rice, those kind of things. So I think, and of course, just wanted to add that if you're, gastro diplomacy, of course, is something that really exists. I, as well as probably Daisuke too, who grew up abroad, and parents working in either diplomatic situations or in other foreign countries, we all know the role of dinners play, dinners and lunches, official dinners and lunches. They come to the Japanese ambassador's house and they expect Japanese food. Sometimes they're surprised because they're being served French. But but in any case, so I think rather than trying to sort of assess what things are, the power of food in terms of these very sort of scholarly approaches, I'd like to sort of hand over to Daisuke to sort of muse about what could be done more effectively, or what are the ways that we can rethink the role of food in, particularly in this post-COVID-19 world where we are seeing borders coming down, but at the same time there is actually the drive for the good culinary experience really hasn't died down. And so I would actually sort of like to ask Daisuke to think about these things and think out loud about these things, and starting off perhaps by telling us how you actually got into thinking about, or of course into the food business as well, but how you've got into thinking this way, and what sort of thoughts and philosophies you've developed over the course of your career. Thank
Well,
you.
right. Well, thanks very much for having me, first of all. It's quite interesting that normally you and I have this sort of conversation late night at some sort of izakaya or the other. I remember when your parents were in New York, you'd asked me to come up there and sort out the wine cellar. It was a bit of a conundrum. And so on, and so we really go way back. Obviously being a cook, or once a chef, I don't really like to call myself chef anymore because I'm not in the kitchen. And I'm old school in the sense that if you are called a chef, you have a particular command of the kitchen and understanding, and you're more in tune to everyday running of the kitchen, really. And sort of my definition is, if you're a chef, you would know what's in your walk-in refrigerator right now, and when did it come in, how old they are, so on and so forth. So I sort of hold that title to a higher position, and that doesn't belong to me. So, but you know, with everybody's a chef these days, I'm often called chef, and I'm kind of tired of correcting people. So sometimes I just kind of let that go. But anyways, how did I come to this? Obviously, I started with making food for people. And back in 1988, when I first basically started my own restaurant, it was a sushi restaurant. And when you know, I was called to a table, you know, one of the servers says, hey, you know, there's a customer who wants to speak to you. So I went over, and there was this gentleman, and it was really kind of comical in a sense that he said, look, I ordered sushi. And I said, yes, this is, you know, I made your sushi. He said, you know, you ordered assorted sushi. So, and then he said, but these are raw fish. And yeah, it is. And they said, but, you know, can I have it cooked? And first I was just, you know, taken back, but I said, well, you know, look, this is, you know, this is what you get when you order assorted sushi. But if you don't like raw fish, I can make you something else. It's not a problem. I'll just take this back, and you know, I won't charge you. You know, just order here our cooked section, if you will. You can have grilled chicken or fish or whatever we had on the menu. And he says, no. I want to eat sushi. I just don't want to eat raw fish. So then I went on and said, well, look, you know, I can make you, you know, there are fish, vegetables. There are some cooked, like eel is cooked, you know, egg is cooked and so on. He goes, no, I want sushi, fish sushi, like you would normally do, but I just want it cooked. And I didn't know what to say. And then he saw me and he said, well, can't you just put it in the microwave? Now, normally, one, you know, if you were the type that gets angry readily in the kitchen, you know, that would happen. But for some reason, I didn't take offense. It was more to me as though this man really wanted to understand what we ate. Clearly, he's probably never been to a sushi restaurant before and so on, but he really wanted to have an experience. It's just the raw fish was way too far out for him. So he wanted to say, can you please take a step towards me? Because I do want to understand you. And that was the sort of the beginning of, why am I not angry at this man? You know, I started thinking about it. And then I thought, you know what? Because, you know, if you will, my left brain would have gotten angry, but something came through my right brain, where it's about emotions and so on, that he really wanted to reach out and touch what we did. So I realized that later on, and I thought, you know what, there's something to this, that if you do or try to understand how and what other people eat, it's kind of a powerful message that you send out and coming to that culture or person or group and so on. And, you know, several years later, I started traveling, you know, all over, and I was living in Europe for some time. And, you know, not a criminal offense, but I gotten to the point that I was gonna be arrested by both times in France. It's really about my horrible driving. But, and I started talking about French food and wine both times. And not only did they let me go, they almost escorted me to where I wanted to go, because they were so happy the fact that somebody else understood or tried to understand their food culture. You know, I was grossly overspeeding at one point, and the second time I was basically kind of, you know, what they saw was a reckless driving in middle of Champs-Élysées. So normally, and my friends were horrified. They thought I would be arrested and thrown into jail. And at one point, you know, they took me to police station, and I started talking about food in general. And they said, you know what, we have to call the judge, but we can talk some more. And they made sure, I won't tell which police station because I don't want the officers to get in trouble, but they made sure the court was closed. Then they said, oh, I made a call. And they picked up the phone and said, they're not answering, don't be. And they let me go. So you know, in practice per se, and, you know, I lived in Middle East and, you know, visited Asian countries a lot, other than Japan, obviously. And really, every time I talk about food, I make friends really quickly. People's guard go down. And, you know, that's when I realized this is another form of communication that, you know, one can use to understand each other. It's very difficult to dislike country or people if you really like their food. So that's sort of how it started.
And so after that, I mean, I'm sort of recalling many of the episodes, particularly, and, you know, eating with you. And when you mentioned French, I remember when we went to this very nice restaurant in Kyoto, and you were actually trying to, and also in New York, you were trying to demonstrate how you match Burgundy
and red wines, yeah.
and fish, which
Right.
to this day, I was actually fascinated by in some ways it's not just about the field, but it was something very much based on science as well. There was a logic to why
Yeah.
and how it matched.
Yeah, so that was, I started that because I was a bit pissed off by this article that was written about me on Wall Street Journal a long time ago. On my own with some, you know, wine geek friends back in the 80s, I started pairing sushi, really the sushi that I made, with Burgundy and red wines. And I thought it worked quite well. And, you know, these people who are now very famous winemakers and wine writers in US had agreed, and we were just kind of doing this privately. And then, you know, one day somebody brought an article and says, hey, there's something written about you. So I read it, and the article was written fairly in a sense that it interviewed people who tried it and interviewed people who didn't and so on. But the last quote was some person in, I guess in Boston, I think he's a wine critic, said that I won't try it because I think it'll be a waste of good Burgundy bottle. So being young, and, you know, I was young once, and I would be upset quite easily. I said, okay, you know what? Let's see if this is a waste of wine. First of all, they didn't even interview me. And if you're a professional, why don't you try it before you have an opinion, right? So I was going to Burgundy about twice a year back then, just on my, because I love Burgundy wines. And I have a very good friend named Becky Wasserman, who is sort of the person who made Burgundian small producers known in the United States. I mean, she's a legendary, absolutely fabulous lady. And I went to her and I said, look, Becky, I have a problem. You know, I want to do this and I'm quite pissed. So I want to bring my chefs here. I want to invite the vignerons and I want to show them how to pair their red wines with, you know, Japanese sushi cuisine. And she said, oh, you know, nobody's going to come. And she was right, because, you know, they're very conservative people. But then she said, well, look, but if I invite and do it in my house, they'll have to come. So we did that, and turned out it was, everybody liked it. And for me, I at least had a reason to say, well, look, you know, Burgundians, people think, the producers themselves don't think it's a waste of their bloody wines. So, you know, so there, you know, that was the end of it, really. But what had happened was that it became a thing, and we were asked to come back every year, and we did that for like 5 years, and it became a thing. Now, that is, after several years, that restaurant in Kyoto, whom, remember, I had a big argument with this Japanese chef about this, saying, oh, you know, Japanese food doesn't go well with any other thing except for sake or whatever. And long and behold, he has a bottle of Burgundy wine, Deserto, I remember, because, you know, I imported those to the States, on his menu. So it was not something that I had meant to be a thing, but because of that. But what it did philosophically is that winemaking of Burgundy region is very similar to what's particular about Japanese cuisine, the philosophy of cuisine, what I call it cuisine of subtraction. right? So, in a sense, Japanese culture, the particularity is about, people call it minimalism, but it's more about editing process, calligraphy, poetry, ikebana, and it's about editing out what's unnecessary to show the beauty and complexity of what nature has to offer. I think Chinese cuisine, classic French cuisine is opposite. Their methodology is opposite. They still go about trying to show the beauty and complexity of nature's offering, but they do that by carefully orchestrating and adding, and making a balance, right? I mean, sushi is like, it's literally sliced fish. But if you have to understand the ingredients to show its beauty, very much like ikebana, you take a branch and you snip here, snip here, snip here, and then you show a beauty from certain angle, and then you maybe put 3 of those to show the little universe that these 3 creates. And Burgundian winemaking is very similar to that, because first of all, it's very restrictive. You can't do anything to the grapes, essentially, right? And when you cannot do anything to the grapes, then what's variable becomes very important, such as terroir. There's a concept of terroir. It's the expression of the earth, as they say. So they listen to it, listen to what it wants to do, and try to bring out what it is, essentially. So I saw the philosophical similarity. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go well. The reason I think it goes well with essentially the type of tannin in the Burgundian red wine melts well with umami, and it gives a shape to umami very well. And as the tannin leaves the wine, tannin is also the agent of locking hidden flavors. So the hidden flavors kind of come out. So it's almost like, when you have a piece of flounder, hirame, and then you have a little sip of it, it's almost like hirame coming back, umami of hirame coming back to your palate with bouquet of flowers, and that's how it worked. So, yeah. So it's interesting when you find these kind of, melange, if you will. But that's really not something that it's very difficult to find it. You almost find it by accident. And I'm not a proponent of fusion, if you will. Every cuisine takes its time. It's a battle-tested recipe. And if you try to push them together forcefully, oftentimes you lose the essence of both. So
Can you elaborate a bit more about what you think is the bad example of fusion, or why? I mean, does it always turn out badly, or do some fusion work? And if so, what would be the magic?
Generally speaking, fusion as an ideal of individual, without it being tested in the market, does not work. So, okay, but what works is, for instance, katsukare, right? For those who don't know katsukare, it's a Japanese version of curry and Japanese rice with pork cutlet on top, right? It works, but it's not like somebody just came up with it and started pushing it, Who knows who invented it first? But it took a fairly long time in Japan to become a thing, because it's been honed or romanced in the market. So, I wouldn't want to pull out one bad example, but really it takes for a, generation to become a thing,
I mean, I think it's when we talk about these, the trend in the sort of the late 80s, 90s about, Pacific fusion and so on. I think it's that word fusion, separating that from the body of other sort of, ethnically rooted or tried and tested historical cuisine, seems to be a bit of a I don't know how to say ahistorical, because I think all food in the end, whatever we're eating right now as Japanese food, what we understand as Chinese food or so on, I think it is a fusion.
Yeah, it
They're
pulls
all
from
fusions
one
of
way or
everything.
the other. Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to delineate, and it's very difficult to say what is authentic. If you really start peeling the onion, we don't really know where it ends up. Maybe it ends up in, when the humankind started eating, right? So I don't really want to, I don't like that delineation. I don't really want to get into it. And as such, I don't really like the arguments of different countries or different places saying we are the original, this is ours. Better to sort of concentrate on, well, I love this too. You love that too. How do you do it? Oh, we do it as such, like miso soup, miso shiru in Japan. Every family has their own, right? We don't fight about it. We just say, oh, we love miso soup, right? And as such. So, I think that, look, everything has both sides. But I think food is one of those things that has less of a negative side, if you will, in the argument than most communication tool out there. That's what I think.
No, I think that's the I think and I think this is partly because it's something everybody eats every day. And I know that, for example, I have Italian friends who don't want to eat Italian food in Japan because they think it's not the same as in Italy.
Oh, it isn't.
Yeah,
it's fantastic. It isn't.
I've taken a couple of Italian academics to actually a very good Italian restaurant in Osaka, and they loved it. And it was, and I think it's the same. It's sort of, but it's not because it was like, oh, it's like home, but it was still authentic enough for them, and it was good. And I thought that was a very interesting.
It evoked the emotion that they would have if they would have had that back home. That's when people, I think, if you want to say what is authentic, I think if it evokes the emotion that you get by eating that compared to the original, whatever the original may be, I think that would be what we might call it, authentic. I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not trying to coin or define authentic, but food is very emotional. Creating food in itself is a very left and right brain activity. To get to achieve the right feel that you get from it, not just the taste, the feel you get from it, you have to know each step and need to know what to do. And these are pretty precise, actually. But where you evaluate it, how you evaluate the outcome is on the left, on the right brain. Right? So, so understanding that, I think can help us in defining what is authentic.
No, I think this, the word, and particularly in this era of talking about the woke society, the cultural appropriation, and so on and so forth, the word authentic has come to acquire a sort of, well, how should I say? I wouldn't say political, but it's a more powerful meaning of what it means in what it means to people. It's probably become more subjective rather than being objective.
Yeah, it's subjective in the mass. So, like I said, for me, really what I think is authentic is if it gives me the same emotion when I have what I call it the original. That would be authentic. Now, it may be completely different ingredient, or, look, if you try to mimic, or if you try to do Italian food in Japan, it's extremely difficult because some Italian items, when it leaves Italy, it loses its soul. Now, to abstract, but, it loses something. Same thing, some stuff in Japan, when it leaves Japan, it loses its, I don't know, essence, some. Some items keep more of its essence. Some items completely lose it. You know, to your example, remember you were saying, you know, these wines from Cinque Terre, when you drink it there, it's fantastic, but somehow when you drink it anywhere else, it tastes horrible.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't taste anything like that, right? So some things are like that. You know, it could be the bottling process. Maybe it doesn't, you know, survive in the transit. Who knows? But I forgot my point. Yeah. So the point is, it doesn't have to be the exact same ingredients. If it evokes that feel, if it brings you back that place and time that you had it, to me, that would be an authentic food. And cultural appropriation, you were saying, so I don't really, you know, cultural appropriation has a very sort of negative connotation. And if it's forced together for other reasons other than wanting to be authentic, then it is, I guess, a negative thing. Meaning that if you have nothing to do, I'm not talking about ethnically, but if you have nothing to do with that particular cuisine and you're just doing it because that's what everybody wants to eat. So you know what? I think I'm gonna put together some noodles and throw it in soup and call it ramen, right? Yeah, that might be culturally appropriate. But you know, if somebody really liked ramen and wanted to try to do something, and you know, they did it, and even if it's something slightly different, I think it's okay. I think it has to do a lot to do with the intent of it. If that evokes emotion, then I would call that authentic for me. But like you said, it's, you know, everybody subjective of millions of people. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's something that I'm trying to perhaps getting now is that I think your approach, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the approach to food, whether it's Japanese or not, it's really in something of a right brain, but also the spirit of whatever it carries, the essence of what it is. And I think you've been very conscious, I think, in the effort to convey the message or the spirit of Japanese food in whatever form you present, whether it's through sushi or ramen or in other cases, whatever it is. So could we sort of switch a bit about that sort of what is the essence in your view? What is the essence? What makes Japanese food not necessarily distinct from, say, Korean or Chinese or whatever, but in your view, in that most subjective way, perhaps, the essence of Japanese food, as we perhaps as Japanese should probably be aware sometimes?
Well, you know, with regards to Japanese food, the way we approach food, or really anything, is that we really, really look into the details, right? We almost have become philosophical about it, with really anything at all. And, you know, I think that this is just my own, you know, ideas, but I think that originates in Sakoku, where we had the
closing down the isolating
on the border for what, a couple hundred years or three. So, and then we were very limited to outside influence and obviously outside ingredients and so on and so forth, right? So we had to work with what we had then, whatever it was imported up to that point, or whatever that was available. And you know, there are still market forces. So you have to be better than the next guy, especially when you can't have new ideas, right? And new ideas oftentimes come from foreigners or foreign travels, you know, as such. That's one of the reasons, I guess, the government shut down, because they didn't want any foreign ideas to come to Japan. So in that sense, the food was the same. So when you have limited number of ideas and ingredients to choose from, and when there's still a market force that you need to survive and thrive, you started looking inwards and saying, how can I perfect this and make it better than the next person? And I think that's one of the reasons specialization came to. It is very rare to find in Japan a restaurant that does excellent sushi, excellent tempura, and excellent soba. In fact, I don't know of one that, not that I know of all the restaurants, but probably not, because each one became so specialized, because the deep attention to detail became so important that you couldn't do all of it. And that has a lot to do with what makes Japanese food Japanese, really. You know, that looking inwards within what they have and trying to perfect it. You know, also the Japanese sense of seeing spirit in everything, you know, and, you know, the respect of nature naturally, you know, got to, rather than mixing things up, let's find out what's essentially good about this or that, you know, also cultivation is such. So I think the combination of both made Japanese food the way it is today.
So if that's the case, in that way, I suppose Japanese food in a way is more of a philosophy and a method rather than the menu per se or the ingredients.
Yes, I would say that. And I don't think Japanese food is the only kind of food as such, but Japan had to go into that. You know, when I started my restaurant in the US, until then, I never had to think about it, that what is Japanese food? Because these are the questions that you get asked all the time, especially if you start with a sushi restaurant that's so different. And people ask you, you get asked so many times, so there's sushi, so what do you eat? What is Japanese food? So I actually had to think about that. And I sort of came to, the big thing is, well, the go-to answer is if you use soy sauce and miso and dashi, it's Japanese food, right? I mean, okay, so that's ingredients driven. But then I thought, you know what? It's actually not. It's more of a philosophy driven sort of thing. It's easier to understand that when you're outside. And that's sort of I started comparing the particularness of the to other, you know, cuisine, and I sort of became, oh, it's more of a philosophy-based thing. Now, that is not to say it applies to everything. I mean, today in Japan, you have all kinds of stuff that I wouldn't say it's the subtraction philosophy and so on. But what's particular about Japanese food probably is this philosophical base. You know, and that's why you have, you know, a potter and a chef. There's a definite sort of, you know, connection between the potter and the chef, right? So when the potter makes this beautiful pot, they don't really think about how beautiful the pot is. They think about how is this going to make the food taste better by sight or by feel. Very tactile,
yes,
right?
sight is very important to yeah.
Yeah, and when a very good chef looks at these potteries, earthwares, or what have you, it imagines, oh my God, I can use this to do this, and it's gonna, you know, that sort of symbiotic relationship, if you will, is quite unique to Japan, I think.
Yes, I think if you get somebody like, you know, Rosanjin, who loves eating,
right,
and he creates his own pottery, you know, to sit his food. So I think that is a very ultimate case of that presentation also being part of the entire experience. So I think that's very okay. So I think I want to sort of switch over a bit. Partly there's a question coming in, but just if you'd like to talk a bit about, so from sushi, you went to, now you sort of decided you do ramen.
Right.
And my understanding is Daikaya is chicken stock base, correct?
Actually, Daikaya is Sapporo style ramen.
Sapporo style,
and there's one around the corner called Bantam King, and that's chicken ramen.
Okay. Yeah. But basically, you in the trend, particularly if you go to like Southeast Asia, you know, they love the tonkotsu. I personally don't. Okay. I'm sort of more the traditional, you know, the clear soup, chicken base, whatever. So, but what were the impetus for you to branch out to doing ramen? picking up from that other theme from
Well,
sushi.
yeah, well, it's not really sort of philosophical base or anything. It's more practical, So I was living in Dubai, and then when I came back to the States, I still had Sushiko, obviously, but my wife, who's Russian, she came to US for the first time, and when we came to Washington, she said, "So where do we eat ramen?" I fed her ramen before, and she really liked it. Russian people love soup. They have to eat soup once a day almost. So, and then I said, "There isn't any." And she said, "Well, you have to open one. Where are we gonna eat?" So
Labor of love.
I started doing research again. Now, prior to that, because we all love ramen, right? And we have to have it, and nothing else but ramen will sate that craving. But prior to that, the proper noodles were not available in US. And I had heard that one of the ingredients, kansi, which is a natural salt, alkaline salt ingredient, was not permissible in US or something like that. I just heard it. And I thought, what, this is, I'd like to do it, but it can't work. But because of her, and then when I came back after, about, I don't know, almost 10 years in Europe and 8 years in Europe, a couple of years in the Middle East, I saw, locals eating a lot of this Vietnamese pho. And I realized there's so many Americans loving this thing. So I thought, what? Maybe they are ready to eat ramen as a meal. So it took a very long time. It took about actually 4 years to open from that point on, because I contacted Nishiyama Seimen, who is, they're quite famous in Japan for, they're one of the, I guess, founders of Sapporo ramen in a sense. When this restaurant was trying to develop miso ramen, they really needed the noodles that stood up, if you will, to that hearty soup. And they developed it and so on. So I contacted them thinking I'll be rejected. But to my surprise, they said, "Well, this sounds interesting. Let's have a meeting." And then we met, and I basically sort of give them my credential as a restaurateur, and they said, "Okay, we'll work with you." And they, we started importing noodles from them. So really, the availability of noodles is what led me and my partners to open ramen shop. And to be honest, we really didn't know if it's going to be big or not. Me and my partner sat down and said, "What if nobody orders it?" But we really wanted to keep it, Sapporo style. And I remember the very first day, so happens these tourists from Sapporo came. They were one of the first customers, and they said, "Oh, we're from Sapporo," and I was really scared. And then I said, "How was it?" And they said, "Oh, great! It's like home. It's amazing." Da, da, da. So it's interesting, and many people know this now, but there are more than 26 styles of ramen in Japan, and they're all regional. Tonkotsu or Nagahama style is one of them. And in America, that tonkotsu or Nagahama style sort of became the first hit, if you will. So, a couple of days after we opened, this lady came and sat at the ramen bar and beckoned my chef and said, "When are you going to start making real ramen?" And, he was quite ticked off and said, what are you talking about? So then she proceeded to take the phone and show a photo of Nagahama style ramen and says, "This is real ramen." And that's when we said, what, we actually have to kind of, we need to educate people. So we started doing this thing called Ramen 101. Now we do it with Smithsonian.
Oh my God.
It's really interesting that, these members of Smithsonian Institute will pay money to come and hear what the hell ramen is about. So
fascinating. That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, in that sense, really, food can be an icebreaker and, communicative tools.
I suppose, yeah, I mean, it's really, I think you probably have a lot more sort of ideas about how, not just with Japanese food, but with other cuisines, being and how you can set them as the tools of communication in different contexts between different groups of people. which I would like to pick your brains on at perhaps another occasion, because we are actually sort of have 15 minutes.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, sorry about blabbing about.
No. It's okay. It's like, but because I have a couple of questions, which I will read, and then I would perhaps hand over the microphone to Joe, because Joe he studied Stendhal, he speaks French, he loves wine, but he also loves sushi. He has lived in Japan for over 20 years. He has known better sushi restaurants around, the Kansai area in particular, because, Tokyo is not different, but that I have been to. And so he's the good sushi radar. It's never been disappointing. So I'm sure he's dying to say something. But before that, I'll just read some of the questions that are in the chat room. One is, I wonder if you could elaborate more a bit on the reception and popularization of Japanese food in the US historically, particularly in the context of shifting international relations. Okay. The other one is about what you think and explains the global ramen boom. And another one, oh God, we are getting a lot of questions. So let's see how, I'll hand over to Joe first, and then Daisuke, maybe you can read the other questions. There are two more questions after the ones. So over to you, Joe.
Okay. Well, first of all, Daisuke, thank you very much for joining. That was incredible. And as I say, we're just after lunchtime at the moment, and because I'm on a diet, I have a low-fat Starbucks wrap. But after hearing you, I really feel I want to go out to a restaurant, wine bars, and have all sorts of things. I just wanted to pick up on something relating to the concept of fusion cuisine, because there's I suppose you could almost put it as a snobbishness when it comes to food as to what authenticity is, and it's been sort of repackaged, I think, recently in terms of cultural appropriation. But I feel the argument's still pretty much the same thing. Those people who know what the real thing is are obviously people who are educated or have had the ability or opportunity. So for me, I've probably got a fairly advanced sushi palate because I've had the great joy and privilege to be in Japan, or to have lived in Japan for 20 years and to really care and love. But I started off, my first sushi was in a road in Paris, which leads off from the Sorbonne, and it has hundreds of sushi restaurants in inverted commas, but they're sushi restaurants, and they're grilled chicken restaurants, and they're a sort of hodgepodge of different things. But yet that's the first thing, that was my introduction to cuisine. So I wondered if you might talk on that intersection between the cultural appropriation and on food as a sort of sign of belonging or not belonging, either to a country, but also to a social class or to a globalized elite.
Look, here's the thing about, authenticity and cultural appropriation. Where first of all, if you had, Japanese food in Paris, it was probably along Rue Sainte-Anne.
It was.
Okay, well, there you go. So that place is basically a bunch of Japanese people kind of, congregated there and started doing their own food in a way that they could in Paris. Some ingredients are not available.
You were talking about, no, I was talking about Monsieur Le Prince, and it's off the Sorbonne. It's mainly not Japanese.
Okay, then I can't speak to that, but depends on which year it was. It could have been the second generation of people, like in America, the first generation of sushi chefs, if you will, they were Japanese people. And then the second generation was the people who worked for them. And then they, eventually opened their own restaurants and made sushi more available to general public by introducing, mixed rolls, in a sense, kind of like a mixed pizza, right? Some people shunned that, especially the old timers, said, oh, I remember my my first owner, the first owner of Sushiko, whom I bought it from, he wouldn't make California rolls. So I said, that's not sushi. But then eventually he did. But what that did really for the cuisine was it brought in broader audience.
Mm.
And then, you know, by mathematical, you know, law really, few percent is gonna want to know more.
Right.
And they, you know, went deep. Perhaps I don't know where you went, but that could have been it. So
key point, and I think that's sort of what I was sort of going for, is that a lot about sort of the label of cultural appropriation. Of course, if it's you should know better, maybe, but many people don't know better, and they need to know better. And part of knowing better is that dance, I suppose, where you're allowed sort of the innocence of sort of finding things out. And I think that's an important space for food, and in all sorts of different cultures as well. I don't know, because the thing is fusion cuisine, fusion jazz, fusion world music. It all sort of comes with this thing, and yet this is often, as you say, like people's first step into the unknown.
Right. Yeah. You know what? If it's an honest attempt by that person to wanting to do that cuisine, even if it's not completely authentic and ingredients or technique or appearance or whatever, if it's an honest attempt, I think it's great, because, you know, that generally means that they like that culture or that cuisine and they want to do it. Right. If it's, say, a tourist place that has, you know, confit de canal next to California roll, I think I might have a problem with that. You know, so it really has to do with the intent. Right. You know, again, it's about emotion that, you know, that invokes.
Okay. So, the second thing I wanted to pick up on you is the wine aspect, and that is the Burgundian wines with sushi. I've never had that, but of course it wouldn't come as any surprise that because many people think, oh, just white wine is served with fish, but of course in France there's many instances where red wine is served with fish, and so perhaps that's a lot about what our perceptions from the outside are about a given cuisine. You know, that we say, okay, this Indian cuisine is all like this, or Chinese cuisine is all like this. And that, I suppose, can be sort of said with the French, and like you have red wine with this and you have white wine with this. So right. I think your exploration certainly into getting people to engage with wines and then experiment a bit, I think is really in a great long tradition and of a conversation, and it's nice to see these conversations happening across national borders, I think, as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, you know, if you go to Italy and you meet the fishermen, and you know, these people have been eating raw fish for some time now. You know, they just called it. They didn't even have a name, but they just, you know, crudo. And they drink red wine. And they will tell you, I prefer to drink red wine with my fish. So if you actually go to the people who is in it, oftentimes they kind of figure it out, because, you know, that's how they live, right? So, yeah.
Okay, look, I think we probably want to focus on a couple of questions. Actually, apart from the two questions about popularization of Japanese food in US historically, I would like to connect that with Misako's question about esoteric. US prefer to use the word esoteric to talk about some particular Japanese food phenomenon. Being esoteric is certainly fine, but how do you connect this esoteric elements into the bigger market for popular voters and so on? So I think in a way it's about how do we kind of not, you know, get out of the esoteric, exotic mode to becoming more popularized and familiar.
Well, you know, I live in US, and word esoteric, the connotation of esoteric is changing a little bit. In US, what you eat or what you buy is starting to become, especially amongst young people, or how you buy is becoming their identity. And as you establish your identity, you don't want to be same as everybody else. So I would personally won't worry about the word esoteric. I would imagine that esotericness will morph, if you will, into uniqueness, or to a certain extent, coolness, if you will. Being Japanese, having Japanese outlets in US, I meet a lot of, American people who's even never been to Japan, but somehow really vibe, if you will, with the Japanese stuff. And that becomes an identity to them. And if that is esoteric by definition, they really don't care. And to some extent, they might even celebrate it because they're different from others, right? So, me personally, I'm not too concerned about, fighting the labeling of esoteric, if you will.
Okay. And there's a question about, can you tell us about the role of food in education in the framework of Japanese parents or institutions passing over a way to appreciate and cook Japanese food? Perhaps.
Right. If you are a Japanese parent, the best way to pass that on is by cooking it.
Yeah, I agree.
My wife is Russian. She makes Russian food. Now we have part Russian food and part Japanese food on the table because she likes Japanese food too, which is quite interesting. She'll make, pelmeni, which is quintessential Russian food, and I'll make gyoza sauce with it, and I'll eat it like that. So
that's interesting. That's good though.
It's quite good actually. But the best way to pass on, if you are a Japanese parent, is to make Japanese food for your kids in the way that you can. It doesn't have to be exactly the way it is. And the days of, being embarrassed of eating ethnic food is over. When I was a kid in Japan, people said, "Oh, you eat that?" And my partner, chef Katsuya, who grew up in US, and his mom made Japanese lunch for him when he was going to school, and he was picked on all the time, to the point that he said, "Mom, could you just make me peanut butter and jelly sandwich just like everybody else?" And today he regrets that. He says, "Oh my God, I wish, but the bento she made was great, and stuff." But those days are over. People, I can't speak for every region, but where I am, if you are eating, your home cooked food, that kind of becomes a little bit of a pride.
Yeah, no, I think it is changing. I mean, because you and I are pretty much the same generation. We've seen how Japanese food accessibility and availability to it have changed. Because I was in London in the 1980s. So, and this was still Japanese sushi was basically still like, Japanese companies like corporate dining space. You had these very expensive ones, only the authentic ones, the chefs who were trained in Akasaka who would actually just, but I think it's changed a lot. It morphed. And as I said in the beginning, from, you have variations of gradations of, kaiten sushi to sushi in the supermarket, and the real deal, I would say. So I think it's changed a lot, and I think this just tracing the arc of Japanese food, and now we're seeing other types of food from the Korean food like the bulgogi and so on, becoming also something joining this. I suppose a reflection of diversity and actually, as you say, if not tolerance, embracing of different types of food being eaten in one particular territorial state. I think this is really great.
And reflection, I think, is a very good word for anybody from anywhere, if they reflect on what they eat, because as Joe said, we do have to eat, and oftentimes when you do something that you have to do, you stop paying attention to it. When was the last time you actually paid attention to your breathing, right?
Right.
So, you know, it's easily forgotten and overlooked, but reflecting on what we eat is the beginning, I think, of, you know, the conversation and the beginning of identity.
Right. Right.
Going to have to
Precisely.
jump in there.
Okay.
Because Haruko, would you like to just briefly?
Yes, I was actually going to sort of close up, but partly because first to say thank you, Daisuke, for your time. I know it's very late there. And I would like to alert the audience to the 3 videos, television programs actually that Daisuke made, which covers Hokkaido. He did the sort of seeking the soul of Japanese food on location in Japan, and he has made them available for showing just for this AAS. And the link to the videos are actually in the chat room. And I do not need to tell everybody, but please do not record these. But I think these videos, if you're interested, if your thoughts about Japanese food or in any an example of how food evolves and what the essence or the spirit of every culinary tradition is about, I think you'll find these videos very interesting and informative and hopefully provocative.
You'll be
So
very
now
hungry when you watch them, so make sure you've got some food around you. And
Yep.
those of you, if you live in the US, they're also available through Amazon Prime. If you're a Prime member, you get to watch it for free. So,
Okay.
So now I'll hand over to Joe.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Haruko. Thank you, Daisuke. That was fantastic. We look forward to hopefully seeing you again. Please do come back and talk more about food. This was a fantastically interesting topic, certainly for me, and I'm sure for everyone watching. And I'm sure everyone watching now is going to go off and start rifling around their cupboards or go and find their nearest food emporium and start sort of experimenting and cooking and eating. Okay, so thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining, and parallel sessions will start soon. Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.